I never imagined that a single smile could carry the weight of destruction. She walked through my life like sunlight through a window, warm and bright. And yet, every touch left a scar I could not see until it was too late. The betrayal was subtle, precise, surgical. A whisper of manipulation disguised as care, a hand extended to guide me while quietly dismantling everything I had built. I watched her move, confident and untouchable, unaware that the life she thought she controlled was already shifting beneath her feet. Every favor I gave, every moment of trust, had been collected, catalogued, and turned against me, and I understood at last that the world could be rewritten with quiet patience. That realization did not make me weak. It ignited something darker, sharper, a calm certainty that what had been taken would be returned, measured, and multiplied. And when the first thread of her reckoning began, she would never see it coming. My name is Maya Collins, and for most of my life, I believed that kindness was a currency stronger than ambition. I believed that people could be trusted, that gestures of care were never wasted, and that the world, in its quiet rhythms, would reward honesty. I grew up in a modest neighborhood, the kind where neighbors knew your name, and the streets echoed with the laughter of children chasing the sun. My parents were steady, grounded souls who valued work and loyalty over flair, who taught me that life was not about grand gestures but about the subtle accumulation of decency. I carried those lessons like armor, unaware that armor could be invisible to those who wield cruelty with a practiced hand. Vanessa was always there, the kind of presence that drew attention without asking for it. She did not raise her voice or demand the spotlight, but somehow it followed her, drawn to the effortless confidence in her posture, the calculated warmth in her eyes. She smiled in ways that made people feel they were seen, understood, yet beneath that charm was a precision that few noticed, a quiet orchestration of perception. I first admired her. I thought she was a model of poise, a reflection of what I lacked. She entered our shared circles with ease, flattering the right people at the right moments, slipping into the spaces I had worked for without hesitation, leaving a trail of subtle tension behind her. My generosity, my instinct to help, became a tool she could manipulate, though at the time I could not see it. In my work, I was meticulous, careful with details, a person who measured every action with thought and care. I wanted stability, a life built on the tangible, the achievable. I took pride in creating order where chaos threatened, in building solutions quietly and watching them succeed without needing applause. It was this steadiness, this inherent decency, that made me both vulnerable and indispensable. Friends trusted me. Colleagues relied on me. I carried responsibility the way others carried a coat, naturally, without fanfare. And yet, in Vanessa's shadow, I would learn how quickly trust could be distorted, how kindness could be counted against me, and how the very instincts that made me good would become the instruments of betrayal. It began with a favor, the kind that seemed small enough to be overlooked, but the weight of it pressed silently against my chest. Vanessa's car had broken down one morning, a trivial misfortune, or so it appeared. She called with a trembling voice, soft and carefully pitched to sound desperate, as if the world itself had conspired to leave her stranded. I bought the parts, installed the battery, filled the tank, and watched her drive away with a smile that seemed too practiced, too precise. Gratitude flickered briefly across her face, a spark that disappeared before anyone else could see it. At the time I told myself it was nothing, just a small act of help. Yet in the quiet corners of my mind, a faint discomfort began to take root, a subtle unease I could not name. The pattern emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly. Requests followed, each wrapped in a cloak of necessity. A bill unpaid, a forgotten errand, a subtle hint of personal crisis. I gave, I helped, I sacrificed. My own needs became incidental, easily dismissed in the service of her demands. And she never asked, never acknowledged, never paused to consider the cost. Everything was effortless for her, as if my labor had been her due from the start. Then the first public sting arrived, small but precise, sharp enough to be felt without leaving a trace of evidence. At a family gathering, she spoke in passing about responsibility, about the natural order of people and roles, the way some were born to give and others to receive. She did not name me, but the implication landed like a stone in a still pond. Every glance in the room seemed to tilt toward her. Every nod became validation. I felt my presence shrink, reduced to a shadow at the periphery of her performance. It was a betrayal dressed as observation, cruelty wrapped in civility. I recognized for the first time that her charm was a weapon, wielded with precision, designed to unsettle without revealing intent. Work was no sanctuary. A project I had spent weeks shaping, folding intricate details into a proposal meant to elevate my team, became another arena for her subtle theft. She intercepted an email, made a minor change, and presented it as her own insight. The praise that should have been mine flowed to her instead, a silent, invisible transfer of credit. I did not confront her. I watched, aware of the injustice, aware of how easily she had learned to bend perception to her will. The realization settled in with a cold clarity. This was not a mistake. This was a pattern, a blueprint of manipulation. That evening, walking home through the indifferent streets, I felt the first flicker of understanding. Her hands were in my life, shaping it, diverting it, carving it to fit her narrative. And in that flicker, a small, dangerous seed took root. I would remember this. I would plan. The betrayal was precise, quiet, and methodical, but so would I be. The betrayals grew bolder, accumulating like storm clouds across a sky I had once believed serene. It was not a single act but a relentless series of subtle assaults, each designed to erode my confidence and distort reality around me. Invitations arrived without my name, casually removed as though my absence was invisible. Friends who once offered laughter and support began leaning toward her, enchanted by her effortless performance. Every compliment, every nod of approval, seemed rerouted toward her, leaving me a ghost in my own life. At work, the pattern intensified. Reports I had labored over, meticulously checked and refined, were forwarded with minor edits, transformed into her victories. Meetings that should have celebrated my contributions became stages for her applause. My reputation, carefully built over years of diligence, began to wobble under the weight of her subtle manipulations. Colleagues glanced at me with polite confusion when praise was redirected, as if I had failed to notice her brilliance, while she received recognition I had earned. The humiliation was invisible, surgical, a quiet dismantling of everything I had trusted in myself. The breaking point did not arrive with thunder or rage. It arrived in silence, a single afternoon of reflection that crystallized the scope of her design. The pattern was unmistakable. Every favor I had offered, every compromise I had accepted in the name of peace, had been weaponized. The generosity I had once believed would bind us together had become a series of levers she pulled with precision. The realization struck with the force of inevitability. This was not mere jealousy or chance. This was a calculated, deliberate campaign, a map of my life reshaped to serve her advantage. That evening, as the city lights flickered through the apartment windows, I sat among bills I had always managed, emails I had dutifully answered, reminders I had fulfilled without complaint. They formed a lattice of control I had once accepted without thought. Now, under the clarity of understanding, each thread of manipulation became visible, each act of betrayal a node on a blueprint I could finally read. The rage I felt was tempered by something colder. Comprehension. I was no longer merely a victim. I was an observer of the architecture of my own life, and the building had been built without my consent. In that stillness, a resolve began to form. I would not scream, I would not confront blindly, and I would not allow anger to blind strategy. There was a method to her cruelty, and therefore there could be a method to the response. Every favor I had given, every expectation I had met, would now become the foundation of reclamation. The pieces were in place. The first moves of observation, of subtle redirection, began to take shape in my mind. Her arrogance, her reliance on control, was a weakness. She had assumed the rules of the game were hers to define. I would learn those rules, anticipate her plays, and reclaim the board one invisible step at a time. The transformation began quietly. The hurt, once raw and consuming, hardened into focus. The generosity that had been exploited became leverage. Every memory of betrayal became data, every slight a pattern waiting to be exploited. The first flickers of strategy illuminated the edges of my consciousness. The city, once indifferent, now felt like a canvas, and I, previously a passive participant, was preparing to become the architect of what was to come. By the time night fell, the decision was clear and irrevocable. I would reclaim control not through chaos but through precision. The shift was complete. The innocent, trusting self had dissolved, replaced by someone patient, calculating and unyielding. The game had changed, and I would ensure that every subsequent move unfolded exactly according to plan. The days following my revelation passed in a quiet haze of observation and analysis. I moved through the routines of life with an outward normalcy, smiling, speaking, participating, yet every step was measured, every glance calculated. I became an unseen presence in her world, watching patterns emerge like shadows shifting under a static sun. Each movement she made, every casual word she offered, revealed more about the architecture of her control. I began to map it in my mind, visualizing it as if laying down the pieces of a chessboard. Her assumptions, her habits, her vulnerabilities, all marked and catalogued. I watched the way she handled her friends, the precision in her smile, the exact cadence of her laugh. Even in her triumphs, there were cracks, micro-hesitations, unguarded moments where her confidence faltered for a fraction of a second. Each one became a point of leverage, a place where subtle pressure could be applied. I noted her reliance on predictability, the way she trusted routines, and the small obsessions that structured her day. Her world was orderly because she demanded it, and that order could be manipulated thread by thread. At home, I transformed my own environment into a war room of sorts. Notes were scattered across tables, photographs and reminders pinned to walls, lines drawn to connect past betrayals, habits, and opportunities. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, but it was the scent of intention, of focus, of a mind sharpening itself for action. Every night, I studied her life like a manuscript, annotating, circling, drawing invisible connections that would guide each subtle nudge, each seemingly coincidental disruption. The first steps of execution were almost imperceptible. I altered small details in shared spaces, shifted schedules, redirected communications, and allowed chance encounters to intersect where I knew they would unsettle her balance. A missed message here, a misfiled document there, enough to make her hesitate, to force her to pause and reassess. These were not errors or accidents. They were the delicate opening acts of a symphony designed to crescendo over weeks and months. The tension grew silently, like frost spreading across a window pane, unnoticed until the entire surface had been claimed. I observed her interactions, noting the way she assumed loyalty from those around her. I let those assumptions guide my interventions, exploiting her confidence to plant seeds of uncertainty. Friends began receiving information in altered forms, slight miscommunications that would cause her to question her own recollection. Work responsibilities were nudged, deadlines adjusted, opportunities reoriented, all executed without exposure, all invisible to the untrained eye. Every subtle shift compounded, eroding the stability she had long taken for granted. My preparation extended to the smallest personal habits. I knew the way she relied on certain routines to feel in control, and I quietly disrupted them, forcing micro-adjustments that slowly chipped away at her composure. Calendar shifted. Favored contact delayed. A familiar path through her day subtly rerouted. She felt a friction she could not name, a tension creeping into the spaces she had assumed were safe. The beauty of this approach lay in its invisibility. She sensed disturbance but could not identify the source, and that sense of unease began to tighten around her like a noose she could not see. Each evening, I returned to my maps, my photographs, and my lists, observing the results of each intervention, adjusting the plan with surgical precision. The thrill was not in cruelty. It was in mastery, the knowledge that every act of manipulation was a step toward restoring balance, toward reclaiming what had been taken from me. The slow burn suspense thickened, and the anticipation of the eventual confrontation became a quiet pulse beneath every action. By the time a week had passed, the groundwork was set. She was moving through a world subtly altered, her assumptions quietly undermined, her control now precarious. I remained a ghost in her life, orchestrating shifts she could not perceive, waiting for the precise moment when the cumulative weight of these small disruptions would leave her exposed, vulnerable, and unprepared. The stage was invisible, yet perfectly constructed. And in that silent preparation, I felt the first true surge of power, the understanding that patience and precision could achieve what anger never could. The plan had begun. It was unseen, inevitable, and inexorably moving toward a reckoning she would not anticipate until the final piece fell into place. The culmination of months of meticulous observation and invisible manipulation arrived not with a clash but with a whisper. The world she had so carefully curated, built on the assumption of control and unchallenged influence, began to fracture with a quiet inevitability. Each thread of her security, woven through habits, assumptions, and reliance on others, started to unravel. She did not notice immediately, because the disturbances were subtle, almost imperceptible, like tiny ripples on a still pond that eventually become waves strong enough to overturn a boat. The first signs appeared in her social circles. Friends began to question her memory, her recollection of events, and her intentions. Invitations were misdirected, messages lost or delayed, and the people she relied upon for validation began to drift into uncertainty. She moved through conversations with a polite smile, but a subtle hesitation colored her words, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The confidence that had always been her armor was now a thin veneer, cracking under pressure she could not identify. At work, the consequences multiplied. Projects that once sailed smoothly under her influence began to falter. Emails went unanswered. Deadlines she assumed would be met passed unnoticed. Her colleagues, previously passive in the presence of her authority, began to notice inconsistencies, to question decisions they had long accepted without scrutiny. The image of control she had cultivated so carefully slipped imperceptibly, leaving her to navigate an invisible labyrinth of obstacles I had constructed. Each misstep was deliberate, each disruption a silent instrument in the symphony of her downfall. Psychologically, the impact was even more devastating. The routines she had relied upon to anchor her day no longer functioned as expected. Small habits were shifted or intercepted. Every movement she made carried an unexplainable tension. She began to question herself, her judgment, her memory, her ability to command the reality around her. Fear, subtle at first, began to seep in. A gnawing, creeping anxiety that made even the simplest choices feel perilous. I watched, carefully cataloging each reaction, allowing her uncertainty to compound, letting her arrogance become its own trap. I remained calm through it all, a silent observer whose presence she never acknowledged. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no outburst of fury. My power lay in precision, in anticipation, in the quiet orchestration of outcomes she could not foresee. Every domino was set, and each fell exactly as intended. She became a prisoner of her own miscalculations, caught in the web she had assumed would entangle only others. The final blow arrived as a revelation. Documents, messages, and small yet irrefutable proofs of her manipulations reached the eyes of those she had underestimated. Her reputation, once polished and untouchable, crumbled under scrutiny. Allies turned distant, colleagues became cautious, and the subtle influence she had wielded slipped entirely from her grasp. She was exposed not by chance but by design, by the patient, calculated interventions I had placed in motion months ago. Every reaction had been anticipated, every escape route accounted for. In the quiet aftermath, I allowed myself to observe the full scope of her downfall. She moved like a ship without a rudder, her steps hesitant, her decisions cautious, her certainty replaced by a fragile veneer of composure. The life she had controlled through manipulation and charm had been stripped, piece by piece, until nothing remained but reality in its rawest form. I felt no exhilaration born of anger or revenge. the satisfaction was colder, more precise. It was the satisfaction of balance restored, of injustice addressed not with spectacle but with the quiet inevitability of design. And yet, even in the calm, there was a lingering shadow. I recognized that power is never absolute, that control is fragile, and that the world holds more variables than even the most careful mind can predict. As I traced the outlines of what had been accomplished, I left the smallest threads of ambiguity intact. Subtle, unresolved, a whisper that the story, though concluded, might echo in ways unseen. I stepped away from the final scene, my mind clear, my conscience unburdened. The storm I had orchestrated had passed. The villain's world had collapsed, yet mine remained steady, resilient, untouched except by the meticulous work of reclaiming what had been taken. I allowed a final thought to settle in the quiet spaces. Justice is not loud. It does not demand acknowledgement. It arrives in silence, with precision, and leaves only the weight of inevitability. The day ended, the sun casting long shadows across familiar rooms, and in that light, I understood that some lessons endure beyond confrontation. Some victories exist not in applause or recognition, but in the clarity of restored order, in the cold, unwavering certainty that what was lost has been returned, not to spectacle, but to life itself. And in that certainty, a subtle question remained, a quiet echo. Who would be the next to underestimate the power of patience, observation, and control?